Friends of Herring River presents a Herring River Restoration Project video, Herring River Past and Future, Wellfleet, Massachusetts, 2023. In 1909, a dike was built across the Herring River, drastically reducing tidal flow. The herring run was decimated, and over time the ecosystem severely degraded. After decades of research and planning, the Herring River Restoration Project brings together state-of-the-art infrastructure improvements and management techniques to restore 1,100 acres of coastal habitat. Project co-owners, Town of Wellfleet and the National Park Service. Video made possible by DER and NOAA. A lush green salt marsh landscape fades to a sequence of old black and white photos. A meandering marsh estuary.
Herring River in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, was once a thriving estuary.
A wide expanse of marsh grass split by a river.
1,100 acres of salt marsh between Wellfleet Harbor and the freshwater kettle ponds.
A spit of forested land between two ponds. Fish swim in sunlit water. A reef of oysters glistens at low tide.
It was a nursery for the fish and shellfish that had sustained humans for thousands of years, and a natural buffer to coastal storms.
Huge waves crash. A sequence of old black and white photos, boats and a shack on the harbor.
The first Europeans to settle here were attracted by the fishing, whaling,
Men net fish in the river. Two men cut salt marsh grass with scythes.
and the salt marsh grasses, which they cut to feed their sheep and cattle.
Fishing boats tilted on the mud flats.
But by the late 1800s, the fisheries had been depleted, and the hills had been stripped of trees for fuel and lumber.
Houses set on bare hills. People wait on the edge of the train tracks.
While many abandon the Cape due to lack of work,
A crowd gathers on the bank before a small cruise boat.
a handful of wealthy entrepreneurs banked on a vision of Wellfleet as a future tourist destination.
A tinted black and white photo of bathers on a calm beach. Postcard of a young couple looking across the water framed inside a seashell with text, Souvenir, Wellfleet, Mass. An old document. Report of Messrs. Whitman and Howard, civil engineers, on proposed dike at Herring River, Wellfleet, Massachusetts.
They believed by diking and draining Wellfleet's salt marshes, they could reduce the nuisance mosquitoes while creating more dry land properties.
Close-up on document text. The first and main objective sought is to exterminate the mosquito pest. The second, the draining of the marshes so they may be brought into valuable lands. Sequence of black and white photos of the construction of the dike.
And so the Herring River Dike was built in 1908 and 1909,
A postcard of the completed dike.
restricting the 200 to 300 foot river mouth to 3 6-foot culverts,
3 culverts surrounded by rock embankments.
only one of which allowed salt water into the estuary.
Dead bushes surround a channel of red stagnant water.
Ironically, the lack of tidal flushing caused waters behind the dike to stagnate, perfect for breeding mosquitoes.
A black and white aerial photo fades from meandering river path to straight channels.
To drain the water, ditches were dug and the meandering river was straightened and channelized.
A black and white photo of salt marsh fades to present-day oak forest with many dead pine trees.
However, the drainage of the salt marsh triggered a host of unintended consequences.
Black and white photo of turbulent water entering the river.
In the early 1970s, the original dike started to fail, allowing more salt water upstream.
News headline from October 28, 1971 reads, Herring River Dike wins again.
After lengthy debate, the town decided to rebuild the dike instead of a bridge.
Black and white photos of the dike being rebuilt. John Portnoy, PhD, National Park Service ecologist, retired, stands overlooking the river.
1980, the State Attorney General's office asked the Park Service to collect data.
Brian Karlstrom, former superintendent, Cape Cod National Seashore, with the dike behind him.
We started doing some water quality sampling. There was a fish kill. We started looking a little bit closer, and lo and behold, things were very wrong.
A black and white photo of a fish trap full of eels with text noting skin lesions.
We observed thousands of dead and dying American eels, large eels, all over the bottom, literally thousands.
A net full of small dead fish.
The entire run of herring coming out of the kettle ponds was dying en masse as soon as they hit the estuary downstream of Route 6. And so we realized there was a really serious water quality problem in Herring River.
Gordon Peabody, Director, Safe Harbor Environmental Service, sits in an office decorated with nautical instruments.
We've got a diked marsh that's spewing out totally acidic water. How acidic? Dissolved shellfish.
We knew that If the salt marsh peat were resaturated with water again, with seawater, it would no longer leach sulfuric acid.
Reflection of salt marsh grass on moving water, bright green grass on the bank.
We knew we needed to restore tides and seawater to some extent,
Aerial view moving across salt marsh at the river mouth.
but there were concerns about restoring seawater to the floodplain given the many decades of tidal restriction. So some modeling had to be done that simulates the system with field data.
A satellite image of the river mouth overlaid with a multicolored animation of water levels.
The hydrodynamic model simulates what's happening with the movement of water, the exchange of salt, potential movement of sediment transport.
Kirk Bosma, Senior Coastal Engineer, Woods Hole Group. A satellite image of the river overlaid with green and blue lines to indicate different water levels.
This allows you to predict and say what opening should we consider.
An animation shows changing water currents in the harbor and river mouth.
What's going to happen in these various meteorological conditions, as well as sea level rise increases, how the ecological landscape of the Herring River Marsh Complex was going to change.
A map of the river shows color-coded habitats changing as the tide gates are increasingly opened.
So that's kind of the power of the modeling, and it also helps guide that engineering design process.
A map shows Phase 1 project elements and restored tidal flow.
The restoration will be managed as an incremental process with multiple pieces of infrastructure to support the return of tidal flow, the largest of which is the Chequesset Neck Bridge.
Wes Stinson, project representative, Environmental Partners, stands at the edge of the dike culverts with construction vehicles in the background.
The gates will be oriented to match what the existing flow is.
A bridge design graphic shows the gradual opening of the tide gates.
And then only after construction is complete will the various agencies proceed with raising the tide incrementally at first until they can understand the effects.
Steve Spears, soil conservationist, USDA, sits at the edge of a field of blueberry bushes.
Then upstream, there's a small earthen dike that crosses the floodplain called High Toss Road.
A dirt road with large potholes filled with water. An aerial view shows the river split by the dirt road.
That's like a speed bump to the tide.
Brown water moves through a concrete culvert.
There's a dinky little 5-foot culvert under here, and the whole river has to pass through that.
John Portnoy gestures in front of green foliage.
That's way too small for tidal restoration upstream.
A black and white hand-drawn map shows the extent of the river and marsh before diking.
We need a 30-foot wide opening here, and if you look at old maps like this one, you can see that the opening was about that before the dike was put in place.
Water burbles up through a culvert inches below a small paved road.
The low-lying roads have to be raised, the culverts have to be enlarged.
Carol Ridley, Herring River Project Coordinator, Ridley and Associates.
There are hundreds of acres of vegetation that will need to be managed and cleared.
A construction vehicle topples a dead pine tree. Water pooled in a swampy area.
The marsh is severely subsided, up to 3 and 4 feet in some areas.
An animation shows sediment entering the estuary.
We believe that this flood-dominated tidal system will bring material sediments back into the marsh and help that marsh regain elevation, but it's going to need some help.
Tim Smith, restoration ecologist, Cape Cod National Seashore.
So we intend in certain areas to try to accelerate that process.
A researcher crouches in the marsh grass, then holds up roots and sediment as a hand reaches in to take a photo.
So we have a pilot project underway to test some techniques for using sediment that's been placed on the marsh surface to try to restore that elevation and see how it responds to tidal flow.
Aerial view moving upstream from the mouth of the river.
The purpose behind this entire effort is to restore a damaged ecosystem that is actually impaired under the Clean Water Act.
Brian Karlstrom, underwater footage of a school of herring.
To improve the herring fishery and the ecological function of the entire Herring River network.
Steve Block, habitat restoration specialist, NOAA Restoration Center.
Herring are a really important species of fish through the whole ecosystem because everything eats a herring.
A satellite image of Cape Cod Bay and the Gulf of Maine.
As they go out into Cape Cod Bay and into the greater Gulf of Maine ecosystem, the more herring that go out there, the more they can be eaten by all these commercial and recreational finfish species.
Schools of herring and striped bass swim underwater.
75% of the fish that we consume either eat something that had a time of its life in the salt marsh.
Pool of water ripples in the midst of lush salt marsh grass.
Or actually have part of their life cycle there.
Broad expanse of oysters at low tide.
Improved oyster beds, wild oyster beds, which are incredibly important to for the town of Wellfleet.
Gloved hands sort through the oysters.
And for recreational benefits.
Kayakers paddle through the salt marsh.
There's going to be enhanced recreational access integrated into the Chequesset Neck Bridge behind us.
An aerial view graphic of the bridge shows boat portage facilities and accessibility features.
There's going to be improved habitat for wildlife viewing.
A willet calls from the top of a juniper bush and flies off.
The birding potential in there is just going to be spectacular.
Heavy storm waves crash. State Representative Sarah Peak, Democrat, Massachusetts, stands overlooking the river.
Of course, what we have learned is the best resiliency projects are those where we restore the coastline basically to its natural state.
Camera pans across a broad green marsh.
Salt marshes are naturally designed to act as coastal buffers.
Jeffrey Sanders, Chief of Natural Resources Management and Science, Cape Cod National Seashore.
They help reduce the impact of these coastal storms. And as these storms come in, they dump sediment in the systems, which allow these marshes to grow.
Young grass grows atop fresh sandbanks.
And as they grow, they stay at a level that's not going to be flooded by sea level rise.
Water floods the salt marsh. A crowd gathers at the river mouth overlooking the dike. Text reads, groundbreaking Herring River Restoration Project, Phase 1, March 31st, 2023.
The level of both state and federal resources that are being brought to bear on this project is pretty unprecedented.
State Senator Julian Sear, Democrat, Massachusetts, stands at a salt marsh overlook.
And the scope of the project is unprecedented. And I think we really felt that it was a model for what we should be doing in coastal New England, and across the eastern seaboard.
State Representative Sarah Peak.
The Friends of the Herring River have done unbelievable outreach to get people on board and build consensus around the importance of this project.
Crowd members mingle in front of a poster explaining the restoration project.
So it's a real success story in community organizing and listening to people and having flexibility while never letting go of the core mission.
Gordon Peabody.
Because this is really an expression of a community believing in its future, believing in its tomorrow, believing in its children.
Children play in the water and sand surrounded by dunes and salt marsh. An aerial view from the river mouth looking out towards the bay. Produced by Friends of Herring River and Solano Film Collective. Written, directed, and edited by Evan Portnoy. Featuring, in order of appearance, John Portnoy, Brian Karlstrom, Gordon Peabody, Kirk Bosma, Wes Stinson, Steve Spear, Carol Ridley, Tim Smith, Representative Sarah Peak, Jeff Sanders, Senator Julian Sear. Camera and sound, Evan Portnoy, Shirley Kim Ryu. Archival photos courtesy of Wellfleet Historical Society, the Jones Library Incorporated, Amherst, Massachusetts. Aerial footage courtesy of Dennis Fitzgerald, Michael Sestaro. Modeling visualizations courtesy of Woods Hole Group. This video is made possible by DER and NOAA. Copyright 2023, Friends of Herring River.